My favorite short stories of Flannery O'Connor are the ones I'm most familiar with. I've made videos about my favorites. Now I'm rereading some others that I'm less familiar with. I chose a story published in 1952. I chose it because of the title, Enoch and the Gorilla. So let's talk about the title. Enoch is the name of a character from the Bible. We first read about him in a genealogy of the descendants of Adam and Eve in Genesis. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. Enoch is mentioned in Jude and then again in the book of Hebrews, along with all of those other heroes of the faith. The Hebrews passage highlights his righteousness and how he pleased God. By faith, Enoch was taken from his life so that he did not experience death. Enoch walked so faithfully with God that he didn't die, but he was taken away. So he's way up there on the righteousness scale, right? We don't know it until the first line of the story, but Enoch's last name is Emre. The traditional German meaning of this name signifies hard work, industry, and leadership. In English, it represents reliability and stability within the family. There's a spiritual dimension to the name that suggests someone who guides others to enlightenment. We will return to comment on these names in the end. And then the gorilla, the second character in the title. Gorillas are a lot like humans, but they are not human. They are subhuman. So in the title, we have these two characters, one of them that represents a kind of spiritual transcendence, and the other that represents something less than human. The title, then, presents a really interesting contrast, and I trust Flannery O'Connor is going to mess around with this symbolism. So that's why I picked this story. We are going to read this story, and I will pause for comment and analysis section by section. So let's read. Enoch Emre had borrowed his landlady's umbrella, and he discovered as he stood in the entrance of the drugstore, trying to open it, that it was at least as old as she was. When he finally got it hoisted, he pushed his dark glasses back on his eyes and re-entered the downpour. First lines and first paragraphs are usually really important in a short story. In this one, we meet Enoch Emre, and we learn a lot about him from this small, seemingly mundane moment. He doesn't do very well simply opening an umbrella. And granted, it might be the umbrella, but I think it's him. And the fact that he borrowed the umbrella shows his dependence on people. He struggles to open it, and this likely suggests the difficulty in navigating his world. I like that phrase, when he finally got it hoisted. It communicates the absurdity and the humor of this awkward situation. That word hoisted, it suggests a lot more weight than an umbrella has. Add to that the downpour. It feels like Enoch is ill-equipped to deal with what he's facing or will face in this story, whatever that is. He finally gets the umbrella open. Not really much of a triumph. You get the sense that he's more used to defeats. Yet he doesn't shy away from the rain, so he has perseverance. He pushes his dark glasses back onto his eyes. Perhaps this is an act of defiance, and he steps back into the storm. So what about those dark glasses? They are a little ridiculous. It's not a day for sunglasses. There are a couple of possibilities why O'Connor has him wearing these things. Are they an attempt to shield himself from the world? Or are they a misguided attempt to project a certain image? Or do they suggest blindness? We can't answer these questions yet, but whatever the reason he has for wearing them, they add to the comedy and possibly to the tragedy of his character. The umbrella was one his landlady had stopped using 15 years before, which was the only reason she had lent it to him. And as soon as the rain touched the top of it, it came down with a shriek and stabbed him in the back of the neck. He ran a few feet with it over his head and then backed into another store entrance and removed it. Then to get it up again, he had to place the tip of it on the ground and ram it open with his foot. He ran out again, holding his hand up near the spokes to keep them open, and this allowed the handle, which was carved to represent the head of a fox terrier, to jab him every few seconds in the stomach. He proceeded for another quarter of a block this way before the back half of the silk stood up off the spokes and allowed the storm to sweep down his collar. Then he ducked under the marquee of a movie house. It was Saturday, and there were a lot of children standing more or less in line in front of the ticket box. Enoch continues to battle against this borrowed, broken umbrella. It's funny, but it's also a metaphor of inadequacy. It mirrors Enoch's experience. He is burdened with something barely functional. Yet he has no choice but to make do. And we aren't just talking about the umbrella here. Knowing O'Connor, it's probably some part of his philosophy of life. The fact that the landlady lends him the umbrella only because she doesn't use it shows that Enoch exists on the fringe of society and relationships. The umbrella has this fox terrier handle. It acts like a real fox terrier as it jabs him and stabs him. And then this thing, which is supposed to keep the rain off of him, actually causes the rain to flow down his collar. I hate that. This is a picture of pathetic futility. Finally, he ducks for protection under the marquee of a movie house. Another funny image. Children standing more or less in a straight line. They contrast with Enoch's isolation and disarray. They are sheltered in the social context of a Saturday outing. Enoch remains on the outside, alienated and struggling. Enoch was not very fond of children, but children always seemed to like to look at him. The line turned and 20 or 30 eyes began to observe him with a steady interest. The umbrella had assumed an ugly position, half up and half down, and the half that was up was about to come down and spill more water under his collar. When this happened, the children laughed and jumped up and down. Enoch glared at them and turned his back and lowered his dark glasses. He found himself facing a life-size four-color picture of a gorilla. Over the gorilla's head, written in red letters, was Gonga, giant jungle monarch, and a great star, here in person. At the level of the gorilla's knee, there was more that said, Gonga will appear in person in front of this theater at 12 a.m. today. A free pass to the first 10 brave enough to step up and shake his hand. Enoch was not very fond of children, but that's how this passage starts. But it doesn't continue with what you expect, at least with what I expected. But children always seem to like Enoch. It doesn't say that. Rather, it says they always seem to like to look at him. That's very different. You know what makes children look. Weirdness. That and their innate curiosity. And also they don't understand that it's not polite to stare. And this points once again to Enoch's alienation, especially when they begin to laugh and jump at the spectacle of his continued struggles with the umbrella. Enoch responds to their attention by glaring at them, then turning his back on them. I'm beginning to think that the dark glasses are symbolic of his desire to hide his vulnerability. And maybe they also suggest a kind of self-imposed blindness to the realities of his situation. But then watch what happens as he turns his back to the children. He comes face to face with the garish, life-size poster of Gonga the gorilla. So we have Enoch here and an image of Gonga here. There is some major thematic and symbolic contrasting going on here. Gonga is the giant jungle monarch and great star. He represents celebrity, power, and public adoration. The image and the language on the poster are over the top. Exclamation points and the big promise, here in person. And all that business about the first 10 brave enough to shake his hand. I'm getting parody here. A grotesque parody of heroism and celebrity. Enoch was usually thinking of something else at the moment that fate began to draw her leg back to kick him. When he was 4 years old, his father had brought home a tin box from the penitentiary. It was orange and had a picture of some peanut brittle on the outside of it, and green letters that said, "A nutty surprise." When Enoch had opened it, a coiled piece of steel had sprung out at him and broken off the ends of his 2 front teeth. His life was full of so many happenings like that it would seem he should have been more sensitive to his times of danger. He stood there and read the paper twice through carefully. To his mind, an opportunity to insult a successful ape came from the hand of Providence. Here we have some darkly comic insight into Enoch Emery's character. His life is a series of humiliations to which he seems to be oblivious. He's usually thinking of something else when fate began to draw her leg back to kick him. He's at odds with fate. He's painted as a victim of a bully, but he's also a victim of his own lack of awareness. That anecdote about the surprise tin box illustrates all this. At first glance, it looks like a good idea, but in the end, it's filled with disappointment and betrayal. Not only does he not get any peanut brittle, he also gets broken teeth. This moment encapsulates the bitter irony of Enoch's life. Things are not as they appear, and promises of happiness will result in pain. The narrator even tells us that this kind of thing is the story of Enoch's life, and he doesn't seem to have learned from any of these events. So you could say that he's an oblivious idiot, but there's another side to him. He's also oddly hopeful. He views new situations as opportunities rather than potential threats. There's a tension between his past filled with suffering and his persistent naivete. He reads the poster carefully, twice, and he sees an opportunity. It's not that he will have an opportunity to meet this great celebrity. It's that he will have a chance to insult Gonga. That's kind of twisted, isn't it? If you insult a celebrity right to their face, then you somehow gain stature? That's the kind of thinking that you see on middle school playgrounds. And Gonga is the perfect victim, isn't he? You can insult an ape, and because they don't understand English, they won't understand that they've been insulted, so no retaliation. Maybe it's a symbolic assertion of the modern democratic spirit, an ordinary man insulting a monarch. It reinforces the idea of equality. We modern people don't believe in hierarchy, but what have we lost with our abandonment of it? Of course, one must overlook the irony that this particular king is an ape. I don't think that O'Connor would have us overlook this irony. He turned around and asked the nearest child what time it was. The child said it was 12:10, and Gonga was already 10 minutes late. Another child said that maybe the rain had delayed him. Another said, no, not the rain. His director was taking a plane from Hollywood. Enoch gritted his teeth. The first child said that if he wanted to shake the star's hand, he would have to get in line like the rest of them and wait his turn. Enoch got in line. A child asked him how old he was. Another observed that he had funny-looking teeth. He ignored all this as best he could and began to straighten out the umbrella. In a few minutes, a black truck turned around the corner and came slowly up the street in the heavy rain. Enoch pushed the umbrella under his arm and began to squint through his dark glasses. As the truck approached, a phonograph inside it began to play Ta-ra-ra boom-de-ay, but the music was almost drowned out by the rain. There was a dark illustration of a blonde on the outside of the truck, advertising some picture other than the gorillas. The children held their line carefully as the truck stopped in front of the movie house. The back door of it was constructed like a paddy wagon, with a grate, but the ape was not at it. Two men in raincoats got out of the cab part, cursing, and ran around the back and opened the door. One of them stuck his head in and said, "Okay, make it snappy, will ya?" The other one jerked his thumb at the children and said, "Get back, will ya? Will ya get back?" A voice on the record inside the truck said, "Here's Gonga, folks. Roaring Gonga and a great star. Give Gonga a big hand, folks." The voice was barely a mumble in the rain. The man who was waiting by the door of the truck stuck his head in again. "Okay, will ya get out?" he said. I love that picture of Enoch standing in line with all these children, and it's like they are all instructing Enoch with all the particulars of this anticipated event. And the rain keeps coming down. The wet weather is symbolically dampening the expectations and the dreams of these expectant children, and Enoch. Same with the ta-ra-ra boom-de-ay. It's being drowned out by the rain. The excitement and the glamour is soggy. So much about this scene is disappointing, in contrast to the expected glitz and glamour. The truck is black, and the promotional image on the side of it is from a different movie. This hints that Hollywood's fame is fleeting. The men are base and bossy. Their cussing and the use of the word "will ya" shows their impatience and annoyance. They are obviously not all that appreciative of the greatness that they serve, and what an honor it is to be so close to the great Gonga. And then that recorded announcement. All this is a metaphor for the hollow nature of celebrity culture. There was a faint thump somewhere inside the van. After a second, a dark furry arm emerged, just enough for the rain to touch it, and then drew back inside. "God damn," the man who was under the marquee said. He took off his raincoat and threw it to the man by the door, who threw it into the wagon. After 2 or 3 minutes more, the gorilla appeared at the door, with the raincoat buttoned up to his chin and the collar turned up. There was an iron chain hanging from around his neck. The man grabbed it and pulled it down, and the two of them bounded under the marquee together. A motherly-looking woman was in the glass ticket box, getting the passes ready for the first 10 children brave enough to step up and shake hands. The gorilla ignored the children entirely and followed the man over to the other side of the entrance, where there was a small platform raised about a foot off the ground. He stepped up on it and turned facing the children and began to growl. His growls were not so much loud as poisonous. They appeared to issue from a black heart. Enoch was terrified, and if he had not been surrounded by the children, he would have run away. That's rich. Enoch is so terrified that he would have run away had there not been any children there. The children were there, and obviously had much more courage than he did. This big reveal of the gorilla movie star is very anticlimactic. He doesn't burst out from the truck in spectacle and splendor. Initially, he doesn't want to come out at all. Then just an arm. Then this beast from the heart of Africa needs to put on a raincoat. Finally, he unenthusiastically emerges. Once he's out, we don't see an actual gorilla, but some kind of a hybrid. The way he wears the raincoat buttoned up to his chin with the collar turned up. The spectacle of this great gorilla celebrity is all very degraded. The narrator doesn't say that the gorilla is obviously a man in a gorilla suit. The narrator is a third-person narrator, but in this instance he is speaking from the perspective of Enoch. The narrator reports what Enoch sees, and what Enoch sees is a gorilla wearing a raincoat. And like the children, he's really into this whole thing. "Who'll step up first?" the man said. Come on, who'll step up first? A free pass to the first kid stepping up." There was no movement from the group of children. The man glared at them. "What's the matter with you kids?" he barked. "You yellow? He won't hurt you as long as I got him by this chain." He tightened his grip on the chain and jangled it at them to show that he was holding it securely. After a minute, a little girl separated herself from the group. She had long wood-shaving curls and a fierce triangular face. She moved up within 4 feet of the star. Okay, said the man, rattling the chain. "Make it snappy." The ape reached out and gave her hand a quick shake. By this time, there was another little girl ready, and then 2 boys. The line reformed and began to move up. The gorilla kept his hand extended and turned his head away with a bored look at the rain. Enoch had got over his fear and was trying frantically to think of an obscene remark that would be suitable to insult him with. Usually he didn't have any trouble with this kind of composition, but nothing came to him now. His brain, both parts, was completely empty. He couldn't think even of the insulting phrases he used every day. There were only 2 children in front of him by now. The first one shook hands and stepped aside. Enoch's heart was beating violently. The child in front of him finished and stepped aside and left him facing the ape, who took his hand with an automatic motion. It was the first hand that had been extended to Enoch since he had come to the city. It was warm and soft. For a second he only stood there clasping it. Then he began to stammer. "My name is Enoch Emery," he mumbled. "I attended Road Mill Boys Bible Academy. I work at the city zoo. I seen 2 of your pictures. I'm only 18 years old, but I already work for the city. My daddy made me come." And his voice cracked. The star leaned slightly forward, and a change came into his eyes. An ugly pair of human ones moved closer, and squinted at Enoch from behind the celluloid pair. "Go to hell," a surly voice inside the ape suit said, low but distinctly, and the hand was jerked away. Enoch's humiliation was so sharp and painful that he turned around 3 times before he realized which direction he wanted to go in. Then he ran off into the rain as fast as he could. This is the pivotal scene of the story. Enoch is searching for recognition and connection, but at the culminating moment, it's the peanut brittle gag all over again. It's humiliation. This moment is preceded by Enoch struggling to find a suitable insult for the gorilla, but he draws a complete blank. Both parts of his brain were paralyzed, the rational part and the emotional part. Or maybe it's deeper than emotional. Maybe it's the primal instinct part. That's thematically appropriate. This signifies Enoch's deeper failure to assert himself. His irreverent wit deserts him at the exact moment he most needs it to make an impression. He ends up standing there feeling exposed and tongue-tied. When he finally reaches the front of the line, the gorilla automatically extends his hand in a rote, impersonal gesture. For Enoch, however, this small act is laden with significance. This is what stalls out his brain. The narrator notes that it is the first hand that has been extended to Enoch since he had come to the city. This highlights the loneliness of his life. No one has truly welcomed or acknowledged him in a meaningful way. It's very sad. The gorilla's hand, though only part of a staged performance, briefly becomes a source of human contact and validation. In response, Enoch blurts out a bunch of personal details. He's desperately trying to forge a moment of genuine interaction. His stammered confession, his name, his age, his job at the zoo, the fact that his father made him come, reveals the depth of his need to be recognized. O'Connor uses this outpouring of information to show Enoch's vulnerability and his eagerness to prove his worth. Yet the gorilla's abrupt, dismissive, "You go to hell," cuts through Enoch's fragile hope. The spectacle is empty and cruel. In an ironic twist, the costume performer, the one ostensibly less than human, inflicts the harshest blow of all. Enoch's reaction, turning around 3 times before bolting into the rain, captures his utter disorientation and shame. He has, in effect, been rejected by a grotesque caricature of fame and importance. The 8-man hybrid is neither genuinely heroic nor truly monstrous, just indifferent. This stark moment cements Enoch's isolation. Even at the point of closest contact, he is rebuffed and humiliated. The next passage is the beginning of a new section of the story. In spite of himself, Enoch couldn't get over the expectation that something was going to happen to him. The virtue of hope in Enoch was made up of 2 parts suspicion and 1 part lust. It operated on him all the rest of the day. He had only a vague idea what he wanted, but he was not a boy without ambition. He wanted to become something. He wanted to better his condition. He wanted someday to see a line of people waiting to shake his hand. All afternoon he fidgeted and fooled in his room, biting his nails and shredding what was left of the silk off the landlady's umbrella. Finally, he denuded it entirely and broke off the spokes. What was left was a black stick with a sharp steel point at one end and a dog's head at the other. It might have been an instrument for some specialized kind of torture that had gone out of fashion. Enoch walked up and down his room with it under his arm and realized that it would distinguish him on the sidewalk. About 7 o'clock in the evening, he put on his coat and took the stick and headed for a little restaurant 2 blocks away. He had the sense that he was setting off to get some honor, but he was very nervous, as if he were afraid he might have to snatch it instead of receive it. Can you see Enoch's particular blend of hope and desperation in this passage? There's an urgency for something, but he has no idea what he's waiting for. His so-called virtue of hope is warped by 2 parts suspicion and 1 part lust. It's not just optimism. His expectation is tinged with restlessness, paranoia even, and a yearning that verges on the carnal. He has a powerful desire to become something. This is his purpose, his aim, his goal. But he has no idea what that something might be. He just wants people to someday want to shake his hand. A lot happens in a simple handshake, right? It communicates several things at once, both physically and symbolically. It's more than a greeting, although it is that. It's an expression of courtesy and a sign of mutual respect. It shows a willingness to engage with another. It can indicate trust and good faith. A handshake also conveys warmth and openness, and it can create a connection, almost instantly. So when Enoch wants people someday to shake his hand, this is not a small thing. Enoch is in his room with a sense that something is going to happen to him, and in his restlessness he transforms the umbrella into a walking stick. He decides that it will distinguish himself. Enoch wants to be noticed, even if it's through something menacing like that stick. He paces around his room with the stick under his arm. He's rehearsing the idea of standing out, being someone special, someone worthy of attention. But as he leaves his room for the restaurant, he is not confident in the results. Is he setting off to get some honor? Or might he have to snatch it instead of receiving it? Isn't O'Connor incredible to do all this characterization and create such weird and wonderful stuff going on inside this character? And she's far from done. He never set out for anything without eating first. The restaurant was called the Paris Diner. It was a tunnel about 6 feet wide, located between a shoeshine parlor and a dry cleaning establishment. Enoch slid in and climbed up on the far stool at the counter and said he would have a bowl of split pea soup and a chocolate malted milkshake. The waitress was a tall woman with a big yellow dental plate and the same color hair done up in a black hairnet. One hand never left her hip. She filled orders with the other one. Although Enoch came every night, she had never learned to like him. Instead of filling his order, she began to fry bacon. There was only one other customer in the place, and he had finished his meal and was reading the newspaper. There was no one to eat the bacon but her. Enoch reached over the counter and prodded her hip with the stick. "Listen here," he said. "I've got to go. I'm in a hurry." "Go then," she said. Her jaw began to work and she stared into the skillet with fixed attention. Enoch has this sense of urgency and self-importance, but Flannery O'Connor puts him into this mundane, cramped diner. He's a regular, and it fits him. It's as unimpressive as he is. Despite its name, the Paris Diner is a narrow space between a shoeshine parlor and a dry cleaning establishment. Doesn't this mirror Enoch's own marginalized position in society? Like him, it too is easily overlooked. But Enoch is on a mission. He just stops for some sustenance before he starts. He always does this before setting out for anything. Again, we see his fixation on routine. I love it that he orders a sweet milkshake. It shows that he's still very much a kid. The waitress hasn't learned to like him, It's an interesting way to say that she just doesn't like him. It's clear that she knows him, well enough that she doesn't even pretend to be nice. The narrator makes the observation that there's nothing to stop her from filling his order, but she deliberately does not do this. This is yet another indication of Enoch's social isolation. Enoch gets impatient and he pokes her in the hip with his recently fashioned stick. Can you imagine? What is he even thinking? The only thing I can think of is that he's desperate to assert some control over his circumstances. By literally poking her, he tries to force her attention onto his needs. He says, "I've got to go. I'm in a hurry." This hints at his inflated sense of purpose. His mission is pressing, even if he doesn't even know what that is. The waitress's response, "Go then," is indifferent, like everything and everyone else is to Enoch. This brief exchange shows again Enoch's longing to be acknowledged and how he is always met by a pervasive indifference. And again, he's left frustrated and humiliated. It's the story of his life. It's sad, but it's not without its humorous qualities. "Let me just have a piece of that or cake yonder," he said, pointing to a half pink and yellow cake on a round glass stand. "I think I got something to do. I got to be going." "Set it up there next to him," he said, indicating the customer reading the newspaper. He slid over the stools and began reading the outside sheet of the man's paper. The man lowered the paper and looked at him. Enoch smiled. The man raised the paper again. "Could I borrow some part of your paper that you ain't studying?" Enoch asked. The man lowered it again and stared at him. He had muddy, unflinching eyes. He leafed deliberately through the paper and shook out the sheet with the comic strips and handed it to Enoch. It was Enoch's favorite part. He read it every evening like an office. While he ate the cake that the waitress had torpedoed down the counter at him, he read and felt himself surge with kindness and courage and strength. Enoch orders a slice of pink and yellow cake. It's a childlike treat, but even while he's eating it, he is restless. He has something to do. He has to be going. He doesn't know what he's got to do. He just has this vague, persistent yearning for purpose. The episode with the man reading the newspaper reinforces Enoch's need for connection. He politely requests some part of the newspaper. When the man hands him the comic strips, Enoch experiences a surge of confidence. This small gesture of kindness from the stranger is enough to fortify Enoch with kindness and courage and strength. See how he clings to any shred of positive human contact? A quick note about the comics. He loves them. He's still like a child in many ways. Also, he reads them religiously every night, like an office. That's a religious ritual. When he finished one side, he turned the sheet over and began to scan the advertisements for movies that filled the other side. His eyes went over the 3 columns without stopping, and then it came to a box that advertised Gonga, Giant Jungle Monarch, and listed the theaters he would visit on his tour, and the hours that it would be at each one. In 30 minutes, he would arrive at the Victory on 57th Street, and that would be his last appearance in the city. If anyone had watched Enoch read this, he would have seen a certain transformation in his countenance. It still shone with the inspiration he had absorbed from the comic strips, but something else had come over it. A look of awakening. The waitress happened to turn around to see if he hadn't gone. "What's the matter with you?" she said. "Did you swallow a seed?" "I know what I want," Enoch murmured. "I know what I want too," she said, with a dark look. Enoch felt for his stick and he laid his change on the counter. "I got to be going." "Don't let me keep you," she said. "You may not see me again," he said. "The way I am." "Any way I don't see you will be all right with me," she said. He flips the paper and sees the advertisement for Gonga, the giant jungle monarch, and he knows now what his mission is. We don't, but it involves Gonga, and it involves a transformation. He tells the waitress, "You may not see me again, the way I am." That's heavy with significance. The waitress provides the counterpoint of not giving a crap. When he sees the ad, a look of awakening shines out of his face. It shows the powerful effect of his illusions. Something about Gonga carries the promise of something extraordinary. Perhaps validation, adventure, or recognition. Whatever it is, Enoch's reaction to the ad shows that he really believes that some grand event or encounter can solve the restless emptiness that he feels. Enoch says, "I know what I want." He has a new resolve. But what that is, we don't know. Is it something meaningful or another fleeting obsession? But he obviously believes that he's headed towards some significant transformation. Enoch left. It was a pleasant, damp evening. The puddles on the sidewalk shone, and the store windows were steamy and bright with junk. He disappeared down a side street and made his way rapidly along the darker passages of the city, pausing only once or twice at the end of an alley to dart a glance in each direction before he ran on. The Victory was a small theater suited to the needs of the family, in one of the closer subdivisions. He passed through a succession of lighted areas, and then on through more alleys and back streets until he came to the business section that surrounded it. Then he slowed up. He saw it about a block away, glittering in its darker setting. He didn't cross the street to the side it was on, but kept on the far side, moving forward with his squint fixed on the glary spot. He stopped when he was directly across from it, and hid himself in the narrow stair cavity that divided a building. The truck that carried Gonga was parked across the street, and the star was standing under the marquee, shaking hands with an elderly woman. She moved aside, and a gentleman in a polo shirt stepped up and shook hands vigorously, like a sportsman. He was followed by a boy of about 3 who wore a tall western hat that nearly covered his face. He had to be pushed ahead by the line. Enoch watched for some time, his face working with envy. The small boy was followed by a lady in shorts. She was by an old man who tried to draw extra attention to himself by dancing up instead of walking in a dignified way. Enoch suddenly darted across the street and slipped noiselessly into the open back door of the truck. The handshaking went on until the feature picture was ready to begin. Then the star got back in the van and the people filed into the theater. The driver and the man who was the master of ceremonies climbed in the cab part and the truck rumbled off. It crossed the city rapidly and continued on the highway, going very fast. O'Connor is building tension in this section. There's tension in Enoch's desperate quest for validation, and this is shown in his urgent journey through the shadowy urban landscape on his way to get to Gonga. His movements as he moves along are bold and furtive. This journey occurs through the dark streets and alleys of the city, through intermittent light, and it ends at the glittering light of the Victory Theater. This image of Enoch's movement from darkness into light is interesting, but notice that the light that he moves into, well, it's less than its glow. O'Connor uses the word glitter, as in all that glitters is not gold. This quest upon which Enoch has embarked, if I am reading the symbols correctly, is a fool's errand. He won't end up with the gold at the end of it, just the iron pyrite. Fool's gold. The marquee of the Victory Theater illuminates the spectacle of Gonga shaking hands with a bunch of ordinary people. Enoch is envious of these people as he watches the proceedings. That line about Enoch being envious? First we have this man, and then we have the boy. Enoch is envious, and then we have a woman. Envy and the little boy go together. I think Enoch is specifically envious of him. So why him? I considered that it might be that he had a supportive family. He's obviously there with his parents, but it's not they who encourages him to shake with the gorilla. It's the impersonal line that does that. I think it is the cowboy hat that he's wearing. I don't think it's the hat per se, but that this little boy has been distinguished from everybody else. We've seen this kind of thinking in Enoch before. He thought that the umbrella stick distinguished him, and this might also be an explanation for the sunglasses as well. But he might also be envious because the little boy belongs. He belongs in the line. Enoch, by contrast, remains apart. He's literally on the other side of the street. But then he decides to slip into the open back door of Gonga's truck. This is a radical move. He's doing something that no one else is doing. They're all queuing up politely. He has moved from being a mere observer to an illicit participant. From the back of the truck rattling down the highway, there are certain thumping noises. These are not ordinary gorilla sounds, whatever those are. It's unclear what Enoch is up to. He appears to know, so we can only wait and see. O'Connor is patient here. The reveal is slow. When the figure slipping out of the van near the railroad crossing, almost falling, and then limping away, we still don't know what's happening. It's Enoch, actually, and his awkwardness tells us something of his precarious condition. He's been changed in some way. He is both literally unsteady and symbolically on the brink of some new bizarre chapter in his quest for acknowledgement. There came from the van certain thumping noises, not those of the normal gorilla, but they were drowned out by the drone of the motor and the steady sound of wheels against the road. The night was pale and quiet with nothing to stir it but an occasional complaint from a hoot owl and a distant muted jarring of a freight train. The truck sped on until it slowed for a crossing, and as the van rattled over the tracks, a figure slipped from the door and almost fell, and then limped hurriedly off toward the woods. Once in the darkness of a pine thicket, he laid down a pointed stick he had been clutching, and something bulky and loose that he had been carrying under his arm, and began to undress. He folded each garment neatly after he had taken it off, and then stacked it on top of the last thing he had removed. When all his clothes were in a pile, he took up the stick and began making a hole in the ground with it. The darkness of the pine grove was broken by paler moonlit spots that moved over him now and again. and showed him to be Enoch. His natural appearance was marred by a gash that ran from the corner of his lip to his collarbone, and by a lump under his eye that gave him a dulled, insensitive look. Nothing could have been more deceptive, for he was burning with the intensest kind of happiness. He dug rapidly until he had made a trench about a foot long and a foot deep. Then he placed a stack of clothes in it and stood aside to rest for a second. Burying his clothes was not a symbol to him of burying his former self. He only knew he wouldn't need them anymore. As soon as he got his breath, he pushed the displaced dirt over the hole and stamped it down with his foot. He discovered while he did this that he still had his shoes on. When he finished, he removed them and threw them away from him. Then he picked up the loose, bulky object and shook it vigorously. In the uncertain light, one of his lean white legs could be seen to disappear. And then the other, and then the other. One arm, and then the other. A black, heavier, shaggier figure replaced his. For an instant it had two heads, one light and one dark. But after a second it pulled the dark back head over the other and corrected this. It busied itself with certain fastenings and what appeared to be minor adjustments of its hide. This is the moment of Enoch's transformation and desperate self-reinvention. He systematically sheds his old identity, literally removing and burying his clothes. The narrator tells us that Enoch is not consciously performing a symbolic ritual, but that's what it is. He doesn't need clothes anymore. He's making a complete break with his past, even if he cannot articulate why. He's sustained some injuries, a gash from lip to collarbone, and a lump under his eye. But this battered appearance contrasts sharply with his internal state. He's happy. So there's this tension between his wounds and his mood. There is an inherent contradiction in his transformation. Once Enoch has buried his clothes, he shakes out the mysterious object. As he begins to put it on, we figure out he's putting on the gorilla suit. The grotesque metamorphosis from one creature to another is wonderfully described, as some parts disappear and other parts appear. At one point he has two heads. In the moonlit darkness, he effectively replaces his human form with a subhuman or bestial image of an ape. As he fusses with the fastenings to make minor adjustments, the transformation is complete. Did you notice that the narrator has changed how it speaks about Enoch? It's like it doesn't know who Enoch is. Like it hasn't observed him since the beginning of the story. Enoch's no longer referred to as he, but as it. This suggests that Enoch is even alienated from the narrator, and by association from us. For a time after this, it stood very still and didn't do anything. Then it began to growl and beat its chest. It jumped up and down and flung its arms and thrust its head forward. The growls were thin and uncertain at first, but they grew louder after a second. They became low and poisonous. Louder again, low and poisonous again. They stopped altogether. The figure extended its hand, clutching at nothing, and it shook its arm vigorously. It withdrew the arm, extending it again, clutching at nothing, and shook. It repeated this 4 or 5 times. Then it picked up the pointed stick and placed it at a cocky angle under its arm and left the woods for the highway. No gorilla anywhere, Africa or California or New York, was happier than he. Enoch is fully transformed, but at first he just stands there for a bit. Then he gets more animated. He starts growling and beating his chest and shaking his arm. He's practicing his handshaking skills. It takes him a bit to step into his new identity. It's all contrived, of course, but he doesn't know that. He believes he's taking on a new, imposing identity, one that fills him with unbridled happiness. For Enoch, this is a great triumph. A man and a woman sitting close together on a rock just off the highway were looking across an open stretch of valley at a view of the city in the distance, and they didn't see the shaggy figure approaching. The smokestacks and square tops of buildings made a black, uneven wall against the lighter sky, and here and there a steeple cut a sharp wedge out of a cloud. The young man turned his neck just in time to see the gorilla standing a few feet away, hideous and black, with its hand extended. He eased his arm from around the woman and disappeared silently into the woods. She, as soon as she turned her eyes, fled screaming down the highway. After he starts walking, he sees a man and a woman. He approaches them with his arm extended. He will shake their hand, as Gonga did. This is the climactic moment, the consummation of the whole quest or transformation. But they don't even notice him. This was not at all what he was going for. And then when they do see him, they freak out and run away. The guy runs this way and she runs that way. This wasn't what Enoch was going for either. By adopting the gorilla persona, he was hoping to gain recognition and inspire awe. Instead, he incites fear and revulsion. O'Connor here inverts the very gesture that Enoch so desperately wanted for himself, the handshake of acknowledgement, into a horrifying spectacle. His transformation gets him nowhere. His newfound identity yields only isolation. Here's the last lines of the story. The gorilla stood as though surprised, and presently its arm fell to its side. It sat down on the rock where they had been sitting, and stared over the valley at the uneven skyline of the city. The narrator no longer refers to our hero as Enoch, but as the gorilla. And his pronoun is no longer he, but it. Picture this in your mind's eye. A guy in a gorilla suit, sitting on a rock in the evening, looking at the cityscape. It's both comic and tragic. This is the picture of the fundamental irony of Enoch's quest. In his attempt to escape loneliness and obscurity, he ends up more cut off than ever. His monstrous disguise only reinforces the barrier between himself and the human community that he sought. So what does this story mean? The general interpretation of Enoch and the Gorilla is that it's a darkly comic exploration of identity, alienation, and the search for recognition. Enoch longs for validation, and so he tries to imitate the artificial, fleeting celebrity of a fake gorilla. And of course, his quest only deepens his isolation. So the story is often thought to be about the emptiness of pursuing superficial approval instead of genuine connection with other people. And this is certainly what this story is about. But I think there's more to it than this. Flannery O'Connor took her faith very seriously, and she wrote out of that faith. And the typical interpretation doesn't take enough of this dimension into account. So I'd like to take a crack at how this story might be read from a more Christian perspective. The first thing is that Enoch is not like his namesake, the Enoch of the Bible who walked so faithfully with God that he didn't die. We might say that the biblical Enoch transcends his humanity. The Enoch of the story moves the other direction, not up, but down. Symbolically, he ends up as less than human in the end. The same with the last name. He fails to live up to the meaning of Emery. Remember, this is all about hard work, industry, and leadership, reliability and stability within the family. We don't see these characteristics in Enoch at all. And then the spiritual dimension of that name Emery, one that guides others to enlightenment. He doesn't guide anyone. He's not even in any way enlightened himself, and less so at the end. He's in the dark. He seeks the light, but he ends up being drawn to the lights, the false lights of the theater marquee. They are false lights in terms of what he needs. At the end, sitting on the rock, he doesn't look up at the stars. He's looking at the skyline of the city. Like modern man, his gaze isn't high enough. I think the meaning of this story hinges on Enoch's failure to live up to his names, and how he instead steps out of humanity. He steps down to the subhuman. As a Christian, O'Connor believes that we live in a divinely ordered cosmos. Everything has a place in this order, and so everything derives its meaning, purpose, and identity from the cosmos, and its creator, and from its relationship to everything else in it. Let's talk about these relationships in the Christian worldview. The first thing we need to understand is that Christians believe that God created human beings in his image. They get this from the first book of the Bible. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. This passage tells us a few things. Being made in the image of God means that every human being is of great value. This is inherent value. You don't have to do anything to have it, or be in the right group or whatever. You just have it by being human. Another thing this passage tells us is that human beings have a great responsibility. We were given the responsibility to rule over the creation. In our secular world, the earth is to be used for our benefit. But in the Bible, ruling means to be responsible for the flourishing of the ruled. Because every human has been created in God's image, we need to be treating everyone accordingly. This is why one of the main commandments in Christianity is to love your neighbor as yourself. These things are part of the identity, meaning, and purpose of being a human being from a Christian perspective. And if there is no God, then there is no inherent value to a person, and there are no obligations to others, and there is no responsibility for the world. Sometime in the 19th century, our culture started walking away from God. So there was this shift in how we understand reality and ourselves. And this shift is a lot bigger than most people think. In this shift, value, meaning, purpose, identity, truth, they all moved from outside us to inside us, into the individual. It had no other place to go. So now I have the responsibility for all those things. I attribute value. I determine my own purpose. I create my own meaning and identity. I determine what is true for me. You can see why we are so radically individual in the modern West. I see myself doing all the things that God did before. This is also why we're so stressed out. Oh, and after we abandoned God, we were forced to abandon reason. So now I am largely controlled by my emotions. So all these things, including identity, is always in flux, because my emotions are. So this is the modern man, a mishmash of ideas that came out of the Enlightenment, existentialism, and postmodernism. Enoch embodies the modern man. As a modern man, Enoch does not experience relationships as deeply embedded in community, tradition, or the transcendent. His relationships are a matter of personal choice, and for him it's not really his choice, but that of others. Enoch craves connection to others. O'Connor would say that it can't be any other way, because that's how human beings are made. But Enoch lives in a world where relationships are voluntary and negotiated, and he's not doing very well with these things. And in a sense, none of us really are. Sure, many of us do better than Enoch, but when relationships are always a choice, and people are always changing, then every relationship is going to be a bit precarious. Enoch is representative of this condition. He doesn't have any fulfilling relationships with other people. His landlady will lend him an umbrella, but only because she doesn't use it. Children look at him like he's a freak. The waitress has not learned, nor will she ever learn to like him. And the man with a newspaper will give him comics because he doesn't really read them. As a modern man, he doesn't have a relationship with God. He attended the Road Mill Boys Bible Academy, but that's all in the past. The only vestiges of religion that remain are those empty rituals. And his relationship with the created world is a little iffy as well. What with all that persistent rain running down his collar and all. Without the meaning, purpose, and identity given to us by God, our community, and the creation, Enoch is left to figure out all these things on his own. He has no other choice. He's the only one that can do it. What is so powerful in this story is what Enoch chooses. He steps out of his position as a human being, and he becomes a gorilla, and not even a real one. As such, he symbolically no longer bears the image of God. He no longer belongs to the community of humanity, nor even the community of gorillas. There is no place for this grotesque hybrid that he has become. He's fallen out of the category of human being, which is the inevitable trajectory of anyone who steps out of the gravity of grace. Enoch is representative of all who try to create value, meaning, purpose, and identity on our own. Sometimes the costumes that we put on are more convincing than Enoch's. And like Enoch did for a while, we are convinced that they are real. But I think O'Connor's point is that they are all as fake and ridiculous as Enoch's. In the absence of a connection to God, we lose meaningful connection to others and the created order. And these are what makes us human. When we step away from these relationships, we step out of humanity. Like Enoch. Thank you, and we will see you next time.